Welcome to week 11. This is part 1.1 of the time elements module. Before we start, I advise that you get a piece of paper, write down some notes as we go through this module. Please also feel free to write down any questions. So, the time elements that we will discuss this week will include year, month, and day. We will learn the rules on how to say these time elements. We will also learn some basic vocabularies on time expression, and some special occasions. We'll learn some new vocabulary such as today and tomorrow, and we will use these new vocabulary in part 1.3 to integrate these with some sentence structures. So let's begin with part 1. There are basic rules in saying dates in Chinese, and the number one rule is the proper sequence of time elements. When we say dates in Chinese, we always begin with the longest time element and so on. We mention dates, and it is common for us to have 2 to 3 time elements, such as year, month, and day. So let's take, for example, the date April 5 in 1965. In this particular date, we have all of the 3 time elements: the month, which is April, the day, which is 5, the year, which is 1965. In English, we usually follow the format of month, day, then year. However, in Chinese, we always begin with a time element that has the longest time period and so on. In this case, the longest time element is the year, then the month, and then the day. So, following this logic, 1965, April 5. So, that's how we arrange the time element according to Rule 1. April 5, 1965 becomes 1965, April 5. But before we continue, let us first learn 3 simple words used in time elements. So, the first word is nian, nian, nian. This means year, nian. Next, 月, 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 or month, 月. And lastly, 日, 日, 日. This means day, 日. So, if we put all of that together, we would use 年, 月, and 日, exactly in that order. 年, 月, 日. 年, 月, 日. Okay, so now that we have that settled, let's move on to rule number 2. This rule says that the numerical value always comes before the time element. Numerical value before time element. Now, what does that mean? Let's take the month December, for example. In Chinese, December is 12月, 12月. So if we break this down, there is 12, which means 12, and 月, which means month. If we examine this closely, we'll notice that there is a numerical value and a time element. So the numerical value is 12, or 12, and the time element is 月, or month. So again, rule number 2 says that we have to mention the numerical value first and then the time element. So in December, it's 12, then 月, 12月. Okay, now let's take a look at January 1, 2020 as another example. In January 1, 2020, there are 3 time elements here. First, we follow Rule 1 by rearranging the time elements with the longest time element first, and so on. This means that year, month, and then day. Therefore, our example January 1, 2020 then becomes 2020 January 1. Now that we have arranged the time elements, we now follow rule number 2. The first element here is year, which is 2020. Here, it has a numerical value of 2020 and a time element of year. Therefore, following rule number 2, it becomes 2020 year. Next, the second time element is month, which is January. It has a numerical value of 1, being the first month of the year, and its time element is month. So following rule number 2, January becomes 1 month. So then 月 or 1月. Lastly, the third element is day, which is 1. Obviously, it has a numerical value of 1 as well, and its time element is day. Again, following rule number 2, day 1 becomes 1 day, or 一日. So, actually, rule number 2 basically just wants us to mention the number first before the time element. Now, if we put all of this together, our example January 1, 2020 becomes 2020 January 1, or 2020年1月1日. If all of this sounds confusing, don't worry. You'll eventually get the hang of it. So let's just sum up rule number 1 and rule number 2 first. We rearrange the time elements according to its length of time, with the longest time element first, and moving on to the next, and so on. Second, we look at each time element. We say its numerical value first, then the time element. All good? Great. Now this brings us to rule number 3. Don't worry, rule number 3 is a very simple one. This rule applies only to the year element. Only to the year element, okay? Again, we basically follow rule number 2 by saying the numerical value first and then the time element. However, the only exception is that we separate each digit of the numerical value. So what does that mean? Take, for example, again, year 2020. First, we take its numerical value, 2020, and then we separate each digit. So that's 2020, or erling, 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 erling. Next, we simply just add the time element, which is year. Therefore, the year 2020 becomes 2020 year, or ling, nian. Okay, so another example is the year 1987. First, we take the numerical value, then separate each digit. So that's 1987, or 1987. Next, all we have to do is add the time element, which is year. So that becomes 1987 year, or 1987年. Got it? Great. So basically, to sum up the 3 rules for saying dates in Chinese. Rule number 1, longest to shortest. Rule number 2, number, then time element. And rule number 3, separate the number elements at the numerical value of the year into digits. So if you have any questions about these rules, please feel free to send me a message. I'll see you in part 2 for some vocabularies on time expressions and special occasions.